over here, or as you can see, all right, we started talking about the life of farmers during that time period. And I ended off by talking about, all right, how farming was changing and the way of life of human beings was really changing at that point as well. That up to really all of human history, from the Neolithic Revolution up into the Industrial Revolution, the vast majority of almost all human beings, 90+% of human beings around the world, had farmed for a living. And just to put that into a modern perspective, if you think about it, today, we still farm in the world, but almost nobody actually farms in Western society. For example, in the United States of America, less than 2% of people are farmers today. But meanwhile, America produces more food than it ever has in human history, with only less than 2% of the people actually engaged in agriculture. And the question is that how could you have so few people actually working in agriculture and produce so much food at the same time? America is the breadbasket. All right. So this is the reason why that is possible. Why? Hello? Can you mute yourself, please? Thank you. All right. So so the question is, guys, how can that happen? And of course, the answer would be technology. And essentially, ladies and gentlemen, the way that machines were making life easier and faster, and goods were being produced quicker and cheaper than ever before in factories, essentially, you could take that same technology or that same point of view, all right, and use machines on the farm, and you can increase the amount of food that could be produced. I remember probably last year, I don't really discuss it really with my students because it's very rarely asked on the global test, but I think it's asked on the AP World Test, all right, about how there was Malthusian, I think that's what it's called, the theory, all right, that the population of the world growing in the 1800s would outstrip the ability for the world to actually produce food, and there'd be actually mass starvation. That was a theory that came out during the late 1800s. Turned out to be 100% false, all right, that we produce more food today than we ever have in human history. All right, starvation actually is at record lows around the world. It's not to say that people are not, hungry around the world. Even in America, there is some hunger, but there isn't mass starvation like there was in basically, for example, if you compare it to like the Irish potato famine of the early 1800s, that doesn't happen very often anymore. It's not to say that it doesn't happen, but it doesn't happen very often, right? And the reason isn't because there's a lack of food; it's because of the political situations that prevent food from getting there. All right, so you have this situation. This really comes into full effect during the Industrial Revolution. You have machines like the seed drill. You have machines like the mechanical reaper, right? And these, the one to plant, all right, and one to harvest. Those are the two hardest jobs of being a farmer, all right? And if you can do those jobs faster and quicker, right, the way that you can do jobs in a factory faster and quicker, you could also produce food faster and quicker than ever before. So farmers going out to the West, in order to compete with other farmers, they must buy this new technology. They have to, because if they can't compete basically with other farmers. So farmers go heavily into debt to buy this latest technology, the mechanical reaper, seed plows, etc. Also, getting your food to market is faster and cheaper than ever before because of the effect of railroads as well. All right, and railroads, and not only do railroads now affect where the farms are going to be because of the fact that basically that the railroads own the land and they're selling it to the farmers, all right, that essentially you could also, again, get your goods to market faster than you ever could before. This puts the farmers in both a good situation, but more of a bad situation as well. First of all, technology is creating change. And as technology creates change, a lot of people don't recognize that change as it's happening. We're going through a similar situation today, and I brought it up many, many times this year when it comes to, for example, the internet and when it comes to your cell phones. It's great that we have this technology. Think about the thing we're dealing with right now. If, God forbid, we didn't have the internet and things like Google and Zoom and smartphones and laptops and high-speed internet connections, etc. All right, God knows what we'd be doing right now in the middle of a quarantine. Who knows what we'd be doing, right? Basically, I mean, the economy is doing terribly right now because of this, but think about how much worse it would be if we didn't have that technology. So good things can come out of the new technology. We're quicker and faster, all right, connected to the rest of the world today. And the same thing, again, is happening with the railroads, all right, at that time. And also for farmers, ladies and gentlemen, right, they're producing more food than ever before. Now, this creates a problem. First of all, because of the fact that these machines are now doing the jobs of human beings. For example, this machine here, the reaper, the mechanical reaper, right, can do the job of 100 people. Meaning that if you're a farmer, but boy, just being a farmer doesn't even necessarily mean that you own a farm. It could mean that you work on a farm also. You don't have a job, all right, because technology is basically taking your job away. That makes people leave the farms and go to the cities to go look for industrial jobs. All right, so you have a huge change in terms of the work that people are actually doing at that time period. But also you have people who are looking at this way of life that's literally been around for 25,000 years, going back to Mesopotamia. And the bottom line is, all right, is they have a hard time accepting the fact that that life is going away. It's very similar to what we're going through with manufacturing jobs in America today. People used to make cars in Detroit. People used to make television sets in America. People used to make all kinds of manufactured goods in America. They blame China for taking away American jobs. That is true to a certain extent. But the bottom line is this also, is that those jobs were also replaced by technology. The jobs that used to be done in factories where people used to basically screw on a nut with a wrench, all right, that job could be done by a robot in a factory today. So a lot of manufacturing jobs in America have been lost to China, that's true, but also those jobs have been lost to technology. And the same thing is happening with farmers during that time period. So farmers are losing their jobs due to this technology. They're leaving and going to the cities, but also the farmers are going into massive debt because of the fact they have to buy this technology in order to compete. Now, that is causing a problem because you basically, the way they look at it is, well, if I buy the technology, I can now compete and I can become a better farmer and I can sell more crops and therefore I can pay my debts. Now, the problem is that now that everybody has that technology, food production expands exponentially, doubles, triples, quadruples, all right? And before you know it, in a very short period of time, from the mid-1800s to the year 1900, the turn of the 20th century, that farmers who are barely scraping by using hand tools are now making more food than they've ever made before in human history. Now that they're making more food, the problem is that there's now all this new food that's been added to the market. And just like where you make goods in a factory and it drops down when you make things faster, it also brings down the price of what you make. On the farms, because they're using machines and they're using new technology, the price of what they make is going down because there's more of it now. There's more food now available. There's no more rice, there's more wheat, there's more corn, there's more barley, there's more livestock, there's more animals, all right, than ever before, which drags down the price of those products, of those commodities. Now that the price has been driven down, farmers are now, they wanted to make more money because of the fact they could use, by using this new technology, but now they're not making more money because they are producing more goods than ever before. And because there's more goods than ever before, the price is dropping down and they're not making any money because of the fact that their crops are now essentially almost worthless. On top of that, the railroads are taking major advantage of this situation as well. The farmers rely on the railroads to get their goods to the marketplace. And the railroads, even though they're not in the sense that we talked about, for example, with with Carnegie Steel or with Standard Oil, all right, they're not monopolies in terms of like one man or one company controlling the entire infrastructure or the entire industry. You do have a situation where you have what's an oligopoly. And what an oligopoly is essentially not a monopoly where one person controls it, but a monopoly where a few people control it. You have these very strong regional monopolies. You have one railroad company in the Northeast. You have one railroad company in the Southeast. You have one railroad company in the Midwest. You got one railroad company in the Southwest. You got one railroad company in the Northwest. You got one railroad company in the Mid-South. All right. Now, those companies, they collude with each other. They set prices with each other. All right. And essentially, they agree to not compete in each other's areas. So although they're not a monopoly in the sense that one person controls it, they are a monopoly in the sense that they are colluding with each other and that they are working with each other to set prices and to basically rip off the farmers more than anything else. So the farmers who are having enough trouble making ends meet because of the debt that they're in for all this new equipment they're buying, and also because of the fact that they're doing so well that now they've driven down the price of what they're selling, which means they don't have the money to pay back the debts that they basically set up to get the equipment in order to make more food. So essentially you have like a catch-22. I got to produce more food to compete, so I got to buy the stuff. But if I buy the stuff, I'm going to go into major debt and I'm going to produce more food, which is going to drive me further into debt. On top of everything else, the railroads are also making this situation as well. This is a very famous cartoon from that time period that explains the problem of the farmers. All right. And if you look at it, you can see basically the farmers are essentially about to be crushed by the railroads. All right. And if you look in the background, the railroads say consolidation. All right. Consolidation, by the way, means the railroad companies are getting larger and larger. Extortion, bribery, all right, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. All right. And the farmers are being treated very, very terribly. This is a cartoon you're very likely to see on a Regents exam or on the AP test. This cartoon really, really, really captures what farmers are thinking at that time period. All right. And essentially what it is, ladies and gentlemen, it's the farmers essentially saying to themselves, listen, all right, they're saying to the world, all right, we are important. We provide basically everything that makes everything run. And I'll explain it to you guys. If you look in the middle, all right, you see a farmer and it says, I feed you all. Now I'm going to take you around the cartoon to show you what they're trying to say in this cartoon, right? If you look in the front, there's the farmer, all right? Meaning if the farmer's in the middle, he's the most important person in society. What does the farmer do? The farmer, all right, I bull and bear for you all right? Meaning that the what I make is traded, all right? So therefore, trade would not happen without the farmer, all right? Let's see here. I physic for you all right? I plead for you all. I rule for you all. Let's see here. Let's see. I preach for you all. I fight for you all right? I sail for you all. I buy and sell for you all right? I carry for you all. I fleece you all. I physic for you all. But the bottom line is that none of those professions, politicians, scientists, all right, sailors, preachers, soldiers, politicians, lawyers, businessmen, bankers, none of them would have their job without the farmer, because the farmer is the linchpin of civilization. If you remember studying last year, that the reason why civilization even began in the world, all right, going back all the way to Mesopotamia, is because people gained the ability to farm crops, all right, in Mesopotamia, in the Fertile Crescent. And if it wasn't for food, people can't settle. And if people can't settle, they can't specialize in other occupations. So essentially what they're saying is that don't forget about the farmer. None of these people would have jobs if it wasn't for the farmer providing food. But if you look at this cartoon, it also says this, all right, that the farmer is somebody that, yeah, you're ignoring him, you're ignoring his problem, all right, but it's not like he is useless in this situation. And if you look at the bottom, it says in a Granger in training for Congress. Farmers are having a very, very hard time. Their way of life is disappearing, and on top of everything else, they're in heavy debt, and on top of everything else, they're being taken advantage of by the powers that be, by the railroads, et cetera, all right? The farmers decide to become organized, all right? And they look at a certain group of people who have shown the way. There are laborers in America working in factories that have shown that if you come together, all right, and you use the word we instead of the word I, that you're more likely to have your pleas, all right, taken care of, all right, by the powers that be, all right, in terms of the fact that if you come in and you complain alone, all right, you're not going to get anybody to listen to you. But if you complain together, you have more power. So taking a cue from the labor movement, all right, that has been sweeping around America in industrialized cities and in factories, the farmers decide to form the agricultural equivalent of a labor union, and they form a movement called the Granger movement. If you look at the word Granger sounds a lot like the word grain, and grain is what farmers grow. I don't know if there's actually if that's actually the derivation of the word, right? But if you think about it, they grow grain. They live out on the range, home on the range. So think about that, guys, right? They live on the range. They grow grain. I think basically it's a combination of those two words. But essentially, ladies and gentlemen, they decide to become politically organized, and they form a movement called the Granger movement. All right. And what the Granger movement is, ladies and gentlemen, is a movement in which, all right, that it's a movement in which they essentially decide to come together, all right, and try to work together as one voice and become politically active in order to get the people, the railroads, and the government, and the banks, all right, who are basically foreclosing on their farms like crazy because they can't pay their debts, right, to listen to them and to try to help them out, or at least to have some sort of basically have a united voice. All right. So one of the things that the farmers want, all right, is they want a way to get out of their debt situation. All right. And if you think about it, and I talked about this the other day, ladies and gentlemen, the farmers in the late 1800s are very similar to, say, college students today. All right. We know that in order to advance in society, in order to get a good job today, you need to go to college. All right. Or at least that's what people said. All right. So people go to college and they go massively into student debt in order to get a good job. Now, the thing is that when they got out of college, they're massively in student debt. So then they have to get a good job in order to pay back that debt. They get the college degree in order to get a good job, in order to get into the middle class, or even to go into in order to become rich, but in order to get into the middle class. So, but the thing is, by going to college, you prevent yourself from getting into the middle class because of the fact that you're in so much debt. All right, it's a revolving cycle. The farmers find themselves in a very, very similar situation. They've taken out a massive amount of debt to buy all this equipment in order to basically become successful as farmers. And they become too successful as farmers to the price where they're making so much food that they've driven down the price, and therefore they're making less money, and therefore they can't pay back that debt. So what they want to do is try to figure out a way, how do we pay back this debt? One of the things that comes out of this is the fact that they want what's called monetary reform. They want the way that money in America is set up to be changed. And let me explain to you what I mean. That the farmers, the Grange movement, we'll call them the Grange movement from this point on, okay? And again, think of the Grange movement as essentially just a labor union for farmers. That's really what it is, all right? They're not technically a labor union, but they're using the same methods labor unions are using, coming together to speak as one voice. One of the things that they want to do is to change monetary system in order to pay back their debts. The problem with debt, all right, is the fact that I borrowed a lot of money at a high interest rate, all right, and now I got to pay back the debt, but I don't have the money to do it. An argument comes out, all right, between what are called gold bugs and silver rights, and I'll explain to you guys what I mean by this. All money up to this point, all right, not only in America, but around the world, and actually this was America, this was what was in America up until the 1970s, all right, when I was young, it was still like this, right, all currency, all money in America, and we explained this in class, money, paper money, all right, is basically just what's called fiat currency. It has value because we believe it has value. But all money up until the 1970s had to be backed up with some sort of a commodity, a precious metal, all right, in order to give the money value. What's called the gold standard. For every dollar that America printed, America had to have an equal amount of gold or silver in its reserves in order to back up that money. Meaning that, for example, all coins up into the 1970s, quarters, dimes, nickels, were made out of silver or maybe even gold. And when you had a dollar bill, you can go to a Federal Reserve Bank, an American bank, an American government bank, and you can take that dollar and say, I don't believe this dollar has actual value. I would like to have this value in silver instead. And they would give you 4 silver quarters, or they give you 10 silver dimes, or 20 silver nickels, all right, in order to, and then when you had that silver in your hand, you had something that actually you knew had value, something that was rare, something there's only so much of it in the world, all right? Now, up to the late 1800s, silver, all right, and gold were basically equivalent in price. Gold was worth a little bit more than silver, but silver and gold were almost equally rare up to that point. And then something happened in the late 1800s that changed that. In the state of Nevada, all right, which was a new state at that time and is a mining state, in the state of Nevada, all right, they made a discovery, all right, and in that discovery, they discovered what was called the Comstock lode, COMSTOCK-LODE, the Comstock lode. And what the Comstock lode was the largest deposit of natural silver ever found literally in human history up to that point. That they didn't know this much silver even existed in the entire world. And they started to mine the silver. It would literally be like finding like a giant gold supply in some certain area of the world that they never knew existed. And what happened is that when they found this giant, humongous load of silver in Nevada, all right, that all of a sudden, because that they had all this silver that they found in the ground that they never knew existed, it was called the Comstock lode. And they've all like, that wasn't the only one. They also found other deposits of silver in the West as well. But the Nevada Comstock lode was by far the largest one. When that came out, when that was found, the price of silver dropped down tremendously. It went from being almost equivalent to the price of gold to where it didn't have any value anymore, but it became much less valuable than silver did at that time period. And again, they were almost equal in price up to that point, but then silver became less valuable up to that point. And by the way, so since that time, it's still been that same way, literally since the late 1800s. What farmers wanted was they wanted what was called free silver, all right? And what they said was, considering this silver was found, all right, then what we want is for silver to now be the standard of currency in America. Why not? We found this silver, all right, it's there, it's plentiful, and let's start making all currency out of silver. When you take currency and you back it up by something that is less valuable, and you just keep on reproducing it over and over and over and over and over again, what that does is, of course, it drives down the price of whatever you're making. And if you start making all currency out of silver, all right, and this was called a Morgan dollar from that time period, all right, and these are the this is a dollar silver coin from that time period, right, that once they started coining silver coins, silver dollar coins, what that did was that then drove down the price, the value of the dollar. And that's exactly what the farmers wanted. All right, if you make coins out of silver, you create what's called inflation. You guys remember studying inflation in Germany before World War before World War II last year. Inflation means that the value of your currency drops. That naturally happens anyway with currency. The American dollar loses between 2 and 3% of its value every single year. It just happens, all right? It's called natural inflation. It just happens. All currencies lose their value over time. When I was young, a can of soda cost 50 cents. Today, a can of soda costs $1, all right? Meaning that the can of soda didn't go up in price. It's just that the value of the dollar went down over the last 30 years, essentially, all right? And now you can create inflation if you either A, just print money up like crazy, all right? Or B, you make coins out of something that is plentifully available. And what was plenty available because the Comstock lode was silver. And for farmers, they wanted that. They wanted silver to be minted because if you mint silver, you then drive down the value of the dollar. And if you drive down the value of the dollar, that means that the debts that are owed by the farmers are also less. Because, yeah, I owe, say, $100, but $100 isn't as much as it was a year ago in terms of its actual value. So therefore, technically, I owe less money. So the farmers in the Grange movement really, really pushed hard for the United States to push what was called for free silver, all right? And remember we talked about J.P. Morgan. J.P. Morgan, all right, who basically was running the finance of America at that time period, all right? This is before we had the Federal Reserve, all right, in America, where the government was basically running the financial well-being of the country. All right, that JP Morgan, remember we said that gold is money, everything else is credit. JP Morgan pushed back very, very hard against this because he looked at this as essentially being like paper money. All right, and if you start basically just printing free silver, all right, and when I say free silver, that doesn't mean that the silver is free. All right, it means that basically you're just printing it freely. All right, you're minting it freely, right? That he was afraid that also that it would reduce the value of his holdings as well, right? His companies, his railroads, etc. So business people wanted to keep the gold standard, all right, but farmers, all right, wanted to go to the silver standard to help them out in terms of their financial situation. All right, so here's some notes, guys, from that, ladies and gentlemen. I'll put it up here, guys, but let me just actually make some points. All right, industrialization was both positive and negative for farmers. All right. Machines like mechanical reapers and seed drills made farming faster and more efficient and drastically lowered food prices. Farmers went deeply into debt to buy the latest equipment. Railroads made it easier to bring goods to market, but the railroads conspired to inflate shipping rates. All right. The Grange movement, what it did was it started in the West, all right, using the tactics of labor unions, joined together to demand their concerns be heard. They became very, very, very politically active. And in the West, the Grange movement essentially became a major third political party or political movement in America. All right, you had the Republicans, you had the Democrats, but then you had the Grange movement, which then morphed into another movement. And if you think about the Grange movement, what is their complaint? The rich railroad companies are keeping them down, and the rich bankers are keeping them down as well. All right. And also the manufacturers, all right, of these equipment are keeping them down as well. So the Grange movement started to elect legislators, governors, senators, congressmen, local state legislators, all right, and started to hire lawyers, all right, to argue cases before the Supreme Court. And they became a very, very, very big political movement. All right. This morphed into a political movement known as the populist movement. And we've talked about populism before when we talked about Andrew Jackson. The root word of populist is population or people, all right? That Donald Trump is a populist. I'm for you and I'm against the powers that be. Bernie Sanders is a populist. I'm for you, I'm against the powers that be. Andrew Jackson was a populist. I'm for you, I'm against the powers that be. The Grange movement said the banks, all right, and the railroads are conspiring against the people. So therefore, we need to become politically active to bring these people down, or at least to treat us fairly. Who were they against? Robber barons, all right, monopolies and trusts, and political machines, which we'll talk about later on. And what they proposed in terms of legislation was, A, an increase in the money supply to cause inflation, which was called free silver, to help farmers pay their debts. They wanted a federal income tax. We have talked about this over and over and over and over and over again. The argument against tariffs, the way that the United States, and this, by the way, was an argument literally going back to George Washington. And we talked about this when we talked about Alexander Hamilton. And we talked about this when we talked about Andrew Jackson. And we talked about this when we talked about John Quincy Adams. And we talked about this when we talked about other early moments. And it's still going on even today with farmers, all right, in terms of farmers hate tariffs. Because the problem with tariffs, all right, is when you charge taxes on imported goods, invariably the other country will then charge tariffs on American goods, as what are called retaliatory tariffs. You give me a tariff, then I'm going to give you a tariff. And the one thing that America exports more than anything in the world, all right, well, one of the things we export more than anything in the world is food. And it's always the farmers who get hit the worst by tariffs. If America charges tariffs on other countries, then farmers are the ones who suffer in the end. It's happening right now. When Donald Trump calls tariffs on, when he declared tariffs on China because of their unfair trade practices, or at least the way that he saw it, China stopped importing American chicken and soybeans. All right, which then made American chicken farmers and pork farmers and soybean farmers and wheat farmers, all right, suffer very, very badly. They wanted an end to tariffs, and they sat there and said, all right, tariffs are what are called a regressive tax. They hurt the people on the bottom. They hurt the farmers, all right? They also hurt the people who are buying goods, all right? If I want to go buy something that's an imported good, all right, whether it be wine or some sort of a machine made in another country, all right, that middle class and poor people, all right, have to pay that tax, and that hurts them very, very badly. Meanwhile, rich people could care less about that. We want a federal income tax. Let's tax the rich, all right, instead of taxing farmers indirectly and taxing people who are buying goods. They also wanted the way that senators were elected to be changed. Up to that point in the Constitution, the House of Representatives was directly elected by the American people. But senators, all right, were appointed by state legislators and governors, all right? They said that's not democratic. We want senators to be more responsive to the American people. So therefore, we want senators, all right, to be elected. We want an amendment to the Constitution where senators are elected directly by the American people. They want term limits for the president and the vice president of the United States. They wanted an 8-hour workday, and they wanted restrictions on immigration, all right? If you look at this populist movement, it's very, very similar to populist movements that are going around today. Bernie Sanders argues for a lot of these same points, and Donald Trump argues for a lot of these same points. They have different ways they want to go about it, but in terms of the populism that existed at that time period, the arguments that they're making, all right, changes to tax laws, all right, that politicians have too much power, all right, that we should limit the power of the president and the vice president, that we should work less, all right, and that we should restrict immigration. This was not a new thing that started with Donald Trump and with Bernie Sanders. This is something that's been around literally since the late 1800s. In 1892, the populist movement was actually a real political party. The Grange movement became the populist movement, all right? Also, a lot of labor unions and their leaders also joined up with the Grange movement because they had a lot of the same goals and they had a lot of the same problems with the powers that be, all right? So you took two movements, the labor movement and then the populist and the Grange movement, and then they joined together and they formed a political party, all right, called the Populist Party, all right? In 1892, the Populist Party nominated James D. Weaver, all right, as their nominee for the presidential election, all right? So in 1892, you now have a third party running for president. I want to go to that election, okay? So here we go. This is the 1892 election. And if you look at the 1892 election, the Populist Party is represented by light green. As you can see, all right, they didn't win, of course. But they did actually win some states, all right, which was pretty remarkable for that time period, all right, and actually would be remarkable today, all right? They put a dent actually in the presidential election, all right? They win states in the West, all right, the states that are being most directly affected by the changes in terms of free silver, in terms of the railroads, in terms of the lives of farmers, all right, that they win 5% of the vote, all right, which is not a giant amount, but it is a big number for a third political party. So if you see it, ladies and gentlemen, if you look at the popular vote also, all right, that it's pretty evenly split, all right, between these two candidates in terms of the Democratic and Republican candidate, right? But they win a nice amount of the popular vote also. They get 9% of the popular vote, right? So they've actually shown that they are a real political movement, all right? They don't win, right? But they make a showing in the election showing that the Populist Party actually has real power. In the 1896 election, as you can see, the Populist Party is nowhere to be seen. And the reason why that is because one political party decides to take on the mantra and the ideas of the Populist Party. In 1896, William Jennings Bryan, all right, who I'll talk about more later on when we talk about imperialism, all right, William Jennings Bryan, who started off as a populist, all right, as part of an other political party, all right, that he joins the Democratic Party, all right? And what he does is the Democratic Party in 1896 incorporates the populist points of view. It incorporates the populist positions into the Democratic Party. So the Democratic Party essentially absorbs the populist movement, all right, and becomes essentially the Populist Party, all right? So there really isn't a need for the Populist Party in the next election because one of the major political parties takes their point of view. William Jennings Bryan, when he runs for president, he puts forward all the different positions that the Populist Party put forward 4 years earlier, all right? So essentially, William Jennings Bryan is running as a Democrat and as a populist in 1896, and he doesn't win the election. All right. Actually, he doesn't win the election. However, as you can see, all right, that in the entire South and throughout the West, he does incredibly, incredibly, incredibly well. All right. In the Electoral College, he only wins 40% of the vote. But if you look at the popular vote, populist positions espoused by the Democratic Party, all right, are very, very, very popular, and they become part of basically the mainstream of the Democratic Party. All right. And a lot of these positions are still held by the Democratic Party even to this day. All right. So that's where I want to go with that. All right. And I want to